Good morning. Welcome to our Bible study this morning. This morning we're looking at lesson number 5 in our 6-part series on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. This morning we'll be looking at another biblical ground for divorce. It's described as departure. We'll be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 7 for our study this morning. This morning we'll be looking at the writings of the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul instructs us on marriage, divorce, and remarriage, just as we've already looked at the teachings of Christ, the teachings of Moses, and now we're looking at the teachings of the Apostle Paul that will help us to come to an understanding of the biblical concept of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. We'll be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We'll look at verses 10 through 16, and then we'll also drop down to verses 39 and 40. Before we begin, let me just one more time remind you, folks, there's a lot of different views of marriage, divorce, and remarriage out there. There's a lot of different teachings on it. I would ask you to please take your time and come to an understanding of marriage, divorce, and remarriage through your own study of the Bible. That means please, don't just believe what I'm teaching because I'm teaching it. Likewise, when you hear other teachers teach on the subject, don't just believe them because they're teaching it. As Christians with the Holy Spirit indwelling us, we have a responsibility to come to our own understanding of Scripture. And I'll tell you, this is one of those areas that Christians in general really do need to understand. What does the Bible teach about marriage, divorce, and remarriage? Let me just say one more thing. I have a book, an electronic book that you can download from my blog. The book takes each one of my YouTube lessons, divides into chapters. So what you have is for each YouTube lesson, you have a chapter in this book. In this book, you'll find additional information that I can't cover during the course of my YouTube lessons. So if you want more information on the subject, and also I think it helps to have the book just to be able to work down through the chapters as you hear this teaching. It kind of helps to have notes in front of you. I think it'll help you greatly to have that book. It's free of charge. It's just a matter of downloading it to your computer so you have it. It's in both Microsoft Word and PDF format. So whichever one works better for your computer, you're welcome to have. To get this book, go to my blog, www.settledinheaven, that's one word, settledinheaven.wordpress.com. Once you get there, look up at the tabs toward the top of the blog. I have different tabs to click on. Find the tab that says Books Available. Click on that tab and it'll take you to the page that has several of my different electronic books listed. One of those is Marriage, Divorce, and Remarriage. Again, there you can choose then from the Word format or PDF format to download to your computer, whichever works best for you. Also, I'm hoping those books will aid in your own personal studies of this subject. In the book, you'll find a lot of different verses listed that apply to the subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. I'm hoping that by having that resource available to you, it'll aid your own studies as you look up for yourself these verses and as you try to come to an understanding yourself of what these verses teach. We've been looking, folks, at divorce, marriage, and remarriage. We've already looked at what marriage is, and we've looked at what divorce is, and the idea of being remarried. To a certain extent, we looked at those things quickly. But we've tried to slow down and take a much longer look at the different grounds for divorce. We saw in the teachings of Christ something described as fornication is a ground for divorce. And we've gone into that in detail, explaining how fornication is basically when a person follows his fleshly desires, he commits acts of sin, and in the process he turns his back on the marital covenant and forsakes the marital covenant. That's basically what fornication is. It's the habitual, unrepentant serving of selfish desires. And in doing so, they are no longer fulfilling their marital covenant. That's what I believe the Lord meant by fornication, and I give many reasons why, including a vocabulary study of the word fornication to help us to understand that. We've also looked in Deuteronomy 24 at Moses' teachings on divorce, and there we saw Moses taught that something described as losing favor with a spouse, something described as hatred of a spouse, The idea of being hard-hearted toward a spouse is what's presented by Moses. And if you remember again, as we studied that in detail, we saw that, you know what? Being hard-hearted toward a spouse and selfish and hateful toward a spouse, that's the same type of sin that Christ was talking about when he used the term fornication. Now, finally, we'll be looking this morning at the Apostle Paul's teachings on divorce in 1 Corinthians 7. And I think we're going to find by the end of our study that once again, what the Apostle Paul teaches or describes as departing from a marriage is actually just another way to describe fornication. It's another way to describe losing favor with a spouse, hating a spouse, being hard-hearted toward a spouse. So I hope we can see by the time our lesson is done today, all three of these teachings fit together perfectly. They don't contradict each other in any way. They actually uphold and they support each other. It's a wonderful thing when you can see how all these verses come together to teach the same truth. And again, as I've tried to bring out before, and I'll bring it out again in our next lesson, our final lesson of the series, I really believe the key to being able to harmonize all the Old Testament and New Testament scriptures is to come to a biblical understanding of what that word fornication means that Christ uses. If we don't understand fornication, I don't believe it's possible to really come to an understanding of how all the teachings of marriage, divorce, and remarriage fit together. Without coming to a proper understanding of fornication, many times these texts seem to contradict one another. Let me give you one example before we get started on this. One of the common teachings of today is that there's only two biblical grounds for divorce: adultery, taught by Christ, and desertion, taught by Paul. That's what many people will say. They look at it as two entirely different things. Well, first of all, I would say Christ doesn't talk about adultery. He said fornication, not adultery to start with. Those are two different things. But let's assume that Christ did teach that adultery was the one ground for divorce. What we're saying then is the teachings of Christ are incomplete. We're saying, when Christ told the Pharisees and his disciples that adultery is the only ground, then we have Paul coming along later writing and adding another ground. That's like Paul was saying, you know what? The teachings of Christ are incomplete. I've got to add another ground that Christ didn't touch on. Folks, to my knowledge, that never happens with any other subject. Anything that Christ teaches on in the New Testament is only, now listen please carefully, it's more fully explained by Paul, but it's not added to by Paul. To my knowledge, and again, if you all know of examples where Christ taught one thing and Paul literally added to it, instead of just further explaining it, he actually changed it and added to it, I really would like to know. I can't think of any offhand. And yet that's what one of the common teachings of divorce does. It says, Christ said only adultery. Then Paul comes along and entirely changes that and says, wait a minute, it's not just adultery, but there's a whole nother way to look at this grounds of divorce thing. Desertion is a ground as well. See, that's changing. That's saying that what Christ taught was incomplete, and Paul has to actually literally add to the teaching of Christ. Instead of Paul simply explaining in more detail what Christ taught. It's two different things. Likewise, a common teaching is Deuteronomy 24, the teachings there don't apply anymore today because that's a part of the law. Okay, if that's so, then what we have to say is this. What Moses allowed as a divorce in Old Testament times is no longer allowed in the New Testament. The Christ totally abolished that, and he set up a whole new system for marriage and divorce in the New Testament. That's the best I can tell. That's basically what you have to say. My problem is this. I truly believe teachings on the family, marriage and divorce, all of those things are a part of God's moral law. Folks, God's moral law has stood throughout Old Testament times and into New Testament times. Examples of God's moral law is the Ten Commandments. Folks, those applied in Old Testament and New Testament times. For us to say that Christ is totally undoing what Deuteronomy 24 teaches, and that he's starting a whole new system for marriage and divorce, to me, the way I look at it, is contradictory. If we understand that the teachings of marriage and divorce are a part of God's moral law. So see, there's a lot involved with this study. It is a complicated study. When you start to look at all the different verses, and believe me, I haven't even covered all the verses in this study that involve marriage and divorce. I've covered what I felt like are the major verses to give us a clear understanding of what the Bible teaches. But as far as individual verses go, look, if you find a verse in the Bible you don't understand in the context of how I'm teaching these verses, feel free to email me, settledinheaven@gmail.com. I'll be glad to answer any questions and explain to you how these other verses fit in. It's just for time's sake. On YouTube, I can't begin to cover all the verses. Even in the downloadable book that I have, I didn't cover all the verses on marriage and divorce. Folks, to do that would be hundreds of pages. And it's just, I wanted to just get the basic principle of what I believe is the truth concerning marriage and divorce out to you all. And I can fill in any gaps that there might be. If you all are willing to ask me questions, I'll be glad to try and answer them. Okay, for today's study, let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul talks about departing. Listen to what's said in verse number 10, the very first verse in this section of Scripture in 1 Corinthians 7:10. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. But if she depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. Okay, and then it goes on, and let not the husband put away his wife. There we find that Paul is equating the idea of departing with the idea of rupturing the marriage agreement, rupturing the marriage covenant. So what I would like us to do is take our time to study what the word depart means, because that'll help us to understand what Paul is talking about as we continue on through our study this morning. The word for depart, the Greek word that is translated depart, is chorizo. It means to place a space between, to divide, or to separate. If you remember, we talked about how the Lord made two people, he brought them together and made them one flesh. Remember, we said it was two individuals bound together as if they were one unit. What's to depart talking about? It's separating those two individuals where they're no longer looked at as one union. To separate them, to put space between them, to divide them. That's what we mean by to depart. Let me give you some ways it's translated. It's translated to put asunder. It's translated to depart. It's translated shall separate. Again, just pointing out the idea, we're talking about a separation. Those two people that were joined together in the sight of God, that God desired to be joined together for their entire life, they end up being separated. How is this word used? It's used to describe sundering a marriage, departing from a physical location where a person was, let's say, in a certain city and they depart out of that city. It's used in the Bible to describe being separated from love in the context of not being able to be separated from Christ's love is how it's used. And it says we can't be separated from Christ's love. So this type of separation can be emotional. It's talking about departing from a marriage, departing from our responsibilities or our obligations. In Philemon, it's used that way, where the slave departed from Philemon. That doesn't mean he simply physically left, which he did leave, but the sin was he removed himself out from serving Philemon when he owed Philemon that service. That's what his departure was all about. It wasn't he just wanted to take a vacation and come back in 2 weeks. It's where he separated himself physically. No. The whole idea in Philemon was the slave Onesimus departed out from Philemon. Philemon was the slave owner. Onesimus was the servant. Onesimus ran away from Philemon so he would not have to serve him any longer. He departed from Philemon, meaning he separated himself from his responsibilities and his obligations to Philemon. A separation from sinners' influences. In Hebrews 7, it talks about how Christ came and was separate from sinners. That doesn't mean physical location. Christ lived right among sinners, but he was separate from them, meaning what? Sinners, their influence did not affect Christ. He was not influenced by sinners. Christ did not allow sin to enter into himself and into his life simply because he was living around sinners. He was separate from sinners. You can see how when we talk about somebody being separate, it's not just talking about physical location, and that's what's important. Because when we get here to verse 7, when it says, "Unto the married I command, not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband," that doesn't mean don't let the wife move out. Sure, that's one way a wife can depart from her marital covenant, but it's not the only way. Do you know two people can live under the same roof and still one of them choose to depart from the marital covenant? Both of them can choose to. They're living under the same roof. Physically, they haven't literally departed from one another, but they make a choice to depart from the marital covenant, to remove themselves out from under its responsibility and their obligation. They decide they're not going to keep it anymore. That's one way to depart from a marital covenant. That's one way that departure takes place. That's what Paul means here when he says, "And unto the married I command yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband." Okay, meaning what? Don't let her forsake her marital responsibilities to her husband. She is at union with her husband. She is at one unit. Don't let her depart, not physically, but in the sense of moving herself out from that one unit, living her life on her own, living her life selfishly, not being concerned about her husband. And he goes on and says, "But and if she depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband." Okay? Because she turns her back on that marital covenant unlawfully, because she commits fornication, because she becomes hard-hearted toward her husband, because she starts to hate her husband, all these things are saying basically the same thing. Because she does that, she needs to always make allowance to be able to return back to her husband. She needs to repent. She needs to get her heart right, and she needs to be willing to get back to her husband. Now that's in the case where she's the one choosing to break the covenant. The husband hasn't broken the covenant. He's been faithful in the marriage. He's been faithful. He loves her. He's caring for her. He's doing all those things that he promised he would do when he made the marriage agreement. She, on the other hand, is the one that's chosen to forsake that agreement and to depart from it. She then is obligated to stay unmarried with the idea she should be repenting and getting back together with her husband. Goes on, "And let not the husband put away his wife." What's good for the wife is good for the husband as well. The husband should not put away his wife in the same way we were talking about the wife putting away the husband. He shouldn't turn his back on the marital agreement and leave her if she's been faithful to it. So just like we saw in all four of the verses where Christ was teaching on marriage and divorce, remember we saw? He emphasized the fact what's good for one is good for the other. In all four, Christ said, if the man departs, except to be for fornication, he sinned, and he will cause adultery to be committed. Well, likewise here, Paul is saying, you know what? If she depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away the wife. The same principles that apply to the woman. If she departs in an unjust way from the husband, applies to the husband if he puts away his wife. What's implied there is for unjust reasons. You can see that back up in verse 10 and 11. So, folks, it was a real issue back then. Is a husband the only one held responsible for breaking covenant, or is the wife as well? Vice versa. Is only the wife to be blamed for breaking a marriage covenant, or can the husband be blamed as well? Both Christ and Paul emphasize both genders are responsible depending on who is the one deciding to break the covenant. So it's not fair to say every time a marriage breaks up it's the husband's fault. It's not fair to say every time there's a divorce it's the wife's fault. It's not fair to say that. Paul and Christ both are making it plain both parties are responsible to keep the marital covenant. If they do not keep the marital covenant, it's the one choosing to break it is the one responsible for the rupturing of the covenant. Look, the husband may choose to break the covenant and no longer keep it. The wife might be the one that ends up filing for divorce. Whose fault is it? It's the husband's. Why? He's the one that chose to break the marital covenant. At that point, a divorce is allowed. And so the wife at that point is allowed to divorce her husband at that point if he breaks the marital covenant, if he no longer is keeping the marital covenant, if he's not keeping his promises to her and he habitually makes a lifestyle of that where he's unrepentant and he just keeps on abusing her, mistreating her, not keeping the promises he made to her. 12. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. Okay? Now, Paul begins to address the idea of married saved and lost being married. If you have a saved person and a lost person living together in marriage, you have, let's say in this case, the wife that believeth not. As long as she be pleased to dwell with him, the saved husband should not divorce her. Now, see, you can see where there could be a lot of confusion, because think of all the times that the Lord talks about living a life separated from sinners. Paul, in his writings, talked over and over again about the need, for example, to be unequally yoked. And there's many different teachings of Paul about being holy, to be separated for the use of Christ. There are some people, that were saved, married to lost people. I'm sure it crossed their mind, look, should I not be married to the lost person because I should be separated? I shouldn't be unequally yoked. Well, Paul's addressing that issue. He's saying, wait a minute. As long as the lost person is willing, how's it say, is pleased to dwell with the saved person should not divorce the lost person. Now, folks, again, if you get back to the basic grounds of divorce we've been looking at throughout this study, that makes perfect sense. To be pleased to dwell with someone doesn't sound to me like you hate them. Doesn't sound to me like you have a hardened heart toward them. Doesn't sound to me like you're committing fornication against them. Doesn't sound to me like you're departing from the marital covenant. See, if they're pleased to dwell with them, that means they're keeping the marital covenant. The wife is choosing to be faithful to her promises even though her husband is saved. So the lost wife says, no, I want to be faithful. I am pleased to be in this marital relationship. I want to keep my responsibilities toward my saved husband. If a lost wife says that, if she's keeping her responsibilities, the saved husband has no right to divorce her. She's pleased to dwell with him. But and the woman who had a husband that believeth not, if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her leave him. Let her not leave him. What's the principle there? What's good for the husband is good for the wife. Turn it around. If you have a saved wife and a lost husband, if the lost husband is pleased to dwell with her, again, meaning if he wants to keep the marital covenant with her, if he wants to care for and love her like he promised her, the saved wife has no reason and no allowance to divorce her husband, even though he's lost. What's good for the husband is good for the wife. The Lord upheld that point, and now Paul is upholding that point as well. But what happens if the lost person wants to leave? Okay, well, first let's go to why. Why it is. What are some of the motives behind a saved person staying married to a lost person? Well, first of all, the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. There's a lot to gain on the lost person's part to remain faithful to their wife or to their husband who's saved. Think about it. There's many ways that the Lord blesses a saved person that spills over to those around them, especially a marital couple. For example, one of the blessings that the Lord gives to saved people is the idea of security and peace. Well, you know what? To a certain extent, that blessing of security and peace many times will wash over to the lost spouse, where the lost spouse will have security and peace in their home because the Lord is blessing the saved person with security and peace. The idea of wisdom to lead children, for example. The Lord may give a saved person the wisdom to lead and guide their children. Well, That spills over onto the spouse. As the saved person sits down and explains things to the lost person, as they share with them the wisdom God has given to them as a saved person, the lost person can gain from that and can gain much knowledge and wisdom. Finally, salvation. As the saved person lives with the lost person, and as the saved person lives their life in such a way that they have a good testimony in the eyes of the lost person can actually be saved by the influence of the saved person. So, man, there's a lot of good reasons why a lost person should remain faithful to a saved person. The idea of the children, for the sake of the children. Many times it will help the children. Now listen to this, as long as the lost person is continuing to fulfill their marital responsibilities, and that's important, they're setting a good example for the children to follow. Whether lost or saved, if they're being a good husband or if they're being a good wife, that's a good example for the child to follow as far as being a spouse. They're being a good parent. That's a part of marital responsibility too. If they're being a good parent, that's good for the child. Once again, by not splitting up a home, the blessings that fall upon the saved spouse will also be shared with the children as well. When the saved spouse, for example, is blessed with their financial needs being met, the children benefit from that. So you can see how, as long as the couple is keeping their marital vows to one another, it's best for the marriage to continue on, both for the lost person's sake and for the child's sake, if there is a child in the family. He goes on, but if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. Okay, here again, you got a saved person, lost person. Now Paul says, but wait a minute. If you have an unbeliever who departs, meaning what? Turns his back on the marital covenant. He separates himself from the marital covenant. Remember, the word depart there doesn't have to mean a physical separation. It could be that. It could be where the lost person literally says, look, I don't want to be a husband anymore. I don't want to take care of my wife. I'm moving out. And he moves out to a hotel room or to another house or something. That's one way to depart from the covenant, but that's not the only way. A lost person can stay under the very same roof as the saved person and yet still choose not to keep the covenant. That's departing from the covenant as well. We saw that in our departure word study. To depart doesn't simply mean physically to depart to a different location. It can mean that, but it means many other types of departure too. Departing from under responsibility or obligations was one of them, remember? That's what we're talking about here. So Paul says, okay, if a lost person says, look, I married this saved person, I don't want to be with them anymore. And sometimes that'll happen because the saved person takes a stand against sin. The lost person might not like that. They might be enjoying the sin they're in. And the saved person is simply trying to lovingly take a stand against that sin because they don't want to see it in the family to affect the children. The lost person wants none of it. Say, look, I don't want anything to do with that. I'm going to turn my back. I'm beginning to hate my spouse for taking a stand against sin. I'm becoming hard-hearted toward my spouse for the stance they're making against sin. He commits fornication in that way, turning his back on the marital covenant because of selfish desires. What happens? He departs from the marriage covenant. What does Paul say? A sister is not under a brother or sister, depending on which the gender case might be, is not under bondage in such cases. But God has called us to peace. Okay? A lost person decides they went out of the marriage, then Paul says you're allowed to let them get out of the marriage then. Really, how can a person stop somebody? If somebody wants to get out of a marriage, how are you going to stop them anyhow? But he said, look, let them depart. Don't feel like you're under bondage. If they're making the choice to get out of the marriage, you leave. Allow them to leave. Remember Deuteronomy 24? Give them the bill of divorce. They depart and they are now free. In Deuteronomy 24, the husband was sending the wife away, but he was the one departing from the covenant. She then was free to remarry. Here Paul says the same thing, just a little different way. The person departing from the covenant, let them depart. The person remaining, the innocent person who wanted to be faithful to the covenant, the innocent person that was trying to love and care for their spouse as they should, they are now free. They're no longer under bondage. But Paul, why did God allow all this to take place? He's called us to peace. He doesn't want abuse in the family. He doesn't want the husband to abuse the wife in front of the child and the child to learn all of that. God has called us to peace. He's called the innocent person to be able to live a life of peace for their sake and for the sake of the child, where there's not abuse, there's not mistreatment, there's not constantly living in a family of hatred. So God says at that point, allow the divorce to take place. It's on them, the person departing, the one who turned their back on the covenant. It's on them. The innocent person is just that they're innocent. They can remarry because God has called us to peace. And again, if you notice, he says a brother or a sister is not under bondage. He's saying again, what's good for one is good for the other. Do you see how Paul is continually emphasizing that point? Just like Christ continuously emphasized that point in his teachings, both on the Sermon on the Mount and when the Pharisees asked him about it. It goes on, for what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? So Paul gets back again to the idea of a proper testimony. He says, look, as saved people, live your life for the Lord in front of your lost spouse. That could be what will lead them to Christ. Then he reminds us once again, as saved people, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband lives. Okay? But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. Okay? Now again, in the context there, we're not talking about a person who is married to someone who has broken the marital covenant. We're talking about a person who is married to someone who is keeping the covenant. If we don't see that, Deuteronomy 24 is entirely opposed, and it's entirely undone. I mean, they're in total opposition to one another. Even the teachings of Paul when he says they're not under bondage in verse 15, that's entirely undone in verse 39, if we don't understand what's being said here. In verses, in 1 Corinthians 7:10 through 16, Paul was addressing if you have a believing or unbelieving spouse. And toward the end of that section, remember, it involved what? If one chooses to leave, the other one is free. That's not what he's talking about in 39. In 39, he's saying, look, as long as a husband wants to dwell with the wife, as long as the husband is keeping the covenant, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband lives. So again, he's emphasizing we need to be sure to understand as long as the spouse is being faithful to the covenant, we should be faithful to the covenant. We are bound to them as long as they live because the Lord desires for marriages to be permanent. But if the husband be dead, at that point then the person will be at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord, meaning she then would only be allowed to marry a person who is saved. And the person who would be in alignment with the will of God for her life. That marriage should only be in the Lord, because remember, she's already experienced marriage with a lost person. So this time around, the saved person should make sure they only marry a saved person who is in the Lord's will for their life. But to make verse 39, to make that apply to just every marriage, folks, you're undoing, you're contradicting what other parts of Scripture clearly say. But if we understand in the context now, we're not talking about somebody wanting out of the marriage. Both, you have one party being faithful, then that puts the responsibility on the other party to stay faithful as well and stay in the marriage. There are no grounds for divorce for the wife. Let's say this is the wife. There's no grounds of divorce for the wife if the husband is being faithful to the marriage covenant. Likewise, husband, there is no grounds for divorce on the part of the husband as long as the wife is being faithful. And that's exactly what's being brought out in 39. Look at verse 40. But she is happier if she so abide after my judgment. I think also that I have the Spirit of God. Okay, she's happier if she abides. Some people make that mean she's happier to remain single instead of being married again, which could be. That could be what Paul's saying. But I also think a part of it is, but she is happier if she so abide in the will of the Lord. Remember, he just instructed her, if she's going to be remarried, only do it in the Lord. Well, I think what's being said is, a part of what Paul is saying is, it's important that you abide in the will of the Lord, whatever that is. You know, if the Lord desires for you to be remarried, the way you're going to be the happiest is to be remarried. If the Lord doesn't want you to be remarried, the way you're going to be happiest is don't be remarried. It's whatever's in the Lord. That's the way she's going to be the happiest. After my judgment, he said a part of what he's saying there is after his judgment. That's what he believes is the proper course for her to take. And I think also that I have the Spirit of God. Paul says he's not only speaking on behalf of himself, but he believes the Spirit is leading him to say these things. Okay, folks, again, you can see there the teachings of Paul. I'm running out of time. You can see the teachings of Paul there. The point I want to bring out one last time is this. When Paul talks about departure, he's saying a spouse is departing from the marital agreement. It doesn't necessarily mean to physically depart, even though it could mean to physically depart. It means more than that. And what Paul is saying is this: when a person chooses to physically, or when a person chooses to depart from the marital agreement, another way to describe that is he's becoming hard-hearted toward his spouse. He's hating his spouse. The spouse has lost favor in his eyes. He is committing fornication. In that case, what happens? It is a divorceable offense. And the end result of that divorce is the innocent party then is free to remarry whom they will. Again, I want to thank you so much for taking time to study the Word with me. I just pray that the Lord might bless you as you study these things and as you seek to come up with what the Bible teaches on your own. May the Lord bless you as you study His Word.